Welcome back to MarsCast, the official podcast of Mid-America Reformed Seminary, where faculty and friends explore the depths of faith, unpack biblical truth, and engage with the critical issues of our time. I'm Jared Luttjeboer, Director of Marketing. Thank you for tuning in. Today, I am joined once again by our interim president and resident church historian, Dr. Alan Strange, and Old Testament professor, Dr. Andrew Compton. How are you gentlemen doing today?
Doing quite well, and it's always good to be with our wonderful listeners. A blessing to them all, but not a papal blessing.
Ditto.
Sure. All right, well...
Don't quite know how to follow that. Hello.
I'll follow this up. There's a new pope in Rome, right?
Part of why we're doing a new episode,
right? Exactly.
This was going to be a two-parter.
Yes.
And then in the middle of the...
And then the white smoke happened.
Boom.
And now we decided to do a third one on our episodes on the papacy. So there's a new pope in Rome. Now, what makes this moment even more intriguing is that he's an American. First time ever in Roman Catholic history. The new pontiff hails actually just down the road from our very own institution. Dr. Strange, enlighten us. What is all the local buzz about the new bishop of Rome?
Well, it is quite interesting, Jared. I live in South Holland, and Dolton, Illinois, which is where he was born, is less than 3 miles from where
Oh, interesting.
I live. So,
are you the guy who put the offer on the house he grew up in?
There you
That's
go.
sold like that, I thought I heard.
Yeah, there you go. So I'm not sure what that means. I mean, when he was first in, the first thing that I heard in terms of his allegiance baseball-wise was to the Cubs, and they were touting the fact that he must be a bit of a tough guy in his own way because he's from the South Side and a Cubs supporter and fan. But it turns out he is a White Sox fan. So I'm a Cubs fan myself. Those that know me. So the White Sox certainly need all the help they can get these days. So I don't know what that all means.
Well, they have a pope now, so
that's right.
It can mean all sorts of things. So as we talk about a new pope in 2025, we're reminded of a very different tone from the past. The Westminster Confession of Faith, of course, that landmark Reformed document from the 17th century, in the original version, once referred to the pope as that Antichrist. Let me just read the original wording from chapter 25, section 6, which discusses the visible church and the role of the papacy. It says, "There is no other head of the church but the Lord Jesus Christ, nor can the Pope of Rome in any sense be head thereof." That's what you're going to read in the Westminster Confession of Faith today. Originally, it ended with, "But is that Antichrist, that man of sin and son of perdition, that exalteth himself in the church against Christ and all that is called God." Now, of course, that's language that draws heavily from 2 Thessalonians 2, describing the man of sin, son of perdition, who exalts himself above all that is God. The Westminster divines interpreted that as applying to the office of the papacy, and of course reflected strong anti-Roman Catholic sentiment in the 17th century Reformed world. So what happened? How did we go from that level of fiery condemnation to today's, you could say, maybe more tempered and even sometimes respectful engagement between traditions?
Right. Well, the listeners should know that in 1903, a set of revisions were entertained with respect to the Westminster Confession of Faith, and that was one of them. Now, most of those revisions, when the Orthodox Presbyterian Church came into being in 1936, most of those revisions were reversed. They went back to what it had been. But one of the ones, there were several, that they kept was the one that eliminated the phrase of the Pope being that Antichrist. And it is that version of the Westminster Confession of Faith that the Orthodox Presbyterian Church adopted at its second General Assembly in November 1936 that also the PCA has as its version. So most of American Presbyterianism, confessional Presbyterianism, this would accept some smaller groups that still adhere to the original, have that. And so they do not any longer, confess together that the Pope is that Antichrist. Now, as we were talking a moment ago before this, it is the case that anybody in our churches, because I was in a presbytery not Well, it was some time ago, and a person said they believed that the Pope was Antichrist. Are they permitted to believe that since it was taken out of what we confess together? And my answer and the answer of the presbytery to them was, well, yes, you can have that. You can hold that the Pope is that Antichrist. You can go with the original as long as it's not something that's, contradicting something in what we have in our standards. The reason that got changed was not because in 1903 ecumenism had developed to the level that it has in more recent times. The reason it got changed, well, in a general way, they were softening the Calvinism of the Westminster Confession. That was an attempt to do that. It wasn't early liberalism, but it was an attempt to eschatology was very much at issue. Dispensationalism was about. And so the notion that Antichrist would be sort of restricted, if you will, to the office of the Pope. Westminster wasn't saying that the Pope in their person so much was Antichrist, but that the office was. And of course, Antichrist means in the place of Christ, right? Instead of Christ, and was in opposition to Christ. So, but at that point, the church in its eschatological thinking had a lot of different possible candidates, and people were taking different approaches. So they didn't feel that there was the consensus for everybody to say as a church, he's that Antichrist. But you're quite right, though, that over time, particularly in the post-Vatican II era. So Vatican II was largely 1962 to 65, and the Roman Catholic Church has sought since then to be more ecumenical. And many, even evangelical churches, have at least in being opposed still and retaining these differences that we have and have talked about in other places, have been, as you indicate, a bit more respectful in the dialogue and not as categorically dismissory.
Let's think about the matter of his name. To our listeners who may not know, popes always choose their papal name intentionally. Man who was elected pope not that long ago chose the name Leo the 14th. What does that name, his chosen name, suggest about his vision, his priorities, maybe even his theology?
Well, that's a very interesting question. You might wonder, the man has taken the name Leo the 14th. So it's Cardinal Bishop Robert Francis Prevost, that's the man's name, who has taken this name. And is it for the last Leo? Is that why he's taken it? Or is it previous Leos? Of course, let me just say the original Leo was quite a man. I mentioned him last time, so-called Leo the Great, 440 to 461, and his tome is the basis of the Chalcedon formulary. But there have been other Leos. Leo the 10th was the one who excommunicated Martin Luther. Now, here's an interesting connection. Martin Luther was a priest in the Augustinian order. Leo the 14th now Leo the 14th, was for 12 years, he served 2 terms back in the States, in the Chicago area, as the general, is it called Vicar General, something like that, of the order of Augustinian priests. So it's interesting that a Leo excommunicated Luther, but Luther himself was an Augustinian priest, and this particular man, unlike his predecessor, who was Franciscan, this man is Augustinian. So, but he has said explicitly that he does take the name the 14th, Leo the 14th, because of his admiration of Leo the 13th, particularly the bull Rerum Novarum. Okay. And that particular bull of our papal encyclical of Leo the 13th really sort of set the plate for Catholic social teaching. Leo the 13th came in, I believe it was 1878, and served till 1903, something like that. I should have checked those precise years, but that's sort of roughly in my head. He followed the longest serving pope, which was Pius IX, who served, I think it was for 32 years. And Pius IX he was extremely conservative, you might say, and was very opposed to democracy, America, capitalism, all of that sort of stuff. And in Rerum Novarum, what Leo does is he strikes a middle course between socialism, which he sees as wrong because it denies private property. It has a number of problems, he thinks, and just an unfettered capitalism, which is, be as greedy as you will at the expense of the worker. And so he's trying to cut a middle course and argue for the value of the worker and the place of the worker and workers' rights and even the rights of unions, all these kinds of things. So Leo XIV now sees himself in that vein, and he's even expressed concern that AI will dispossess workers. He's concerned about robotic technologies and other things and how that's going to impact workers, particularly on the bottom, if you will, right, of the chain or the hierarchy. He's quite concerned about that. He was quite committed to the poor and the care of them in his bishopric and archbishopric in Peru. So I think that's maybe a longer answer than I should have given, but that has to do with part of the reason he took that name.
Right. So given that, then, what kind of a papacy can we expect from him? Will he follow even in the footsteps of his predecessor, Pope Francis? Of course, you can think of his emphasis on humility, global justice, reform. Or could we see a shift, a return to a more traditional tone or something else entirely?
Well, I do think I was looking at my colleague to see if he wanted to speak. He pointed at me, so I'm going ahead here. I do think that temperamentally, from what we can tell, both of his brothers who have been interviewed rather extensively on various stations and other things we can read about him, that he is of a more reserved temperament than Francis was. Francis would tend to say things and float things out there, and then members of the Curia, other people would sort of have to come behind him and say, well, he doesn't mean this, he doesn't mean this. Yeah, damage control. Right. The way that this pope is, that doesn't seem to be the case. He's basically being spoken of by the cardinals and by the church as a kind of a moderate.
Right.
So if you want to see Francis as progressive, he's appreciative of Francis, and they were friends from all we can tell, and Francis promoted him. Mm-hmm. But his temperament and his basic ethos is a more reserved. Let me just say this, and our listeners, I think, will appreciate that. He's a Midwesterner. Yeah. And Francis was more like an East Coast or maybe West Coast guy who would just kind of put it out there, and then you have to deal with the consequences and do the cleanup and the damage control. I don't think, from all we know of Leo XIV, that he's going to be that way. So, I mean, he may substantively agree with and appreciate a lot of things that Francis did, but I think his method of doing that is going to be far more consensus building. But already, for example, Francis was living in a more humble dwelling there. We won't get into the details, in the Vatican. And Leo has moved back to where the Pope normally lives. Mm-hmm. The vestments that he's been wearing, like there's a particular cross that was made for, and Benedict XVI really loved. Francis never used it. He's already used it. He's already using this. And he's already wearing vestments. He came out wearing vestments that Francis never wore. So Francis had this ethos of not only I'm for the poor, but I'm going to attire myself more humbly. I'm going to live more humbly. And I'm not saying that Leo XIV is living or is going to live lavishly, but I think he's going to live more ordinarily as the popes have lived in recent times.
Yeah.
Now, there's been a lot of discussion, too, about how for the first time in history, we have a pope with a social media track record.
Right.
And that's been a very different situation. People are now combing his Twitter feed. I even saw an article where the article's titled, "Why Am I Internet Stalking the Pope?" And I think the writer even has gone back through his Facebook. It sounds like he had a profile that was accessible. And that has led to all kinds of media popularization about, what's this Pope going to be like? And so there's people on the political left saying, he's tweeted very critically of Vice President J.D. Vance and things he's said. Yay, he's anti-MAGA. And then, of course, the response to that is people on the political right going, "Oh no, we've got another woke Pope." And so I think there's a kind of a popular sentiment or popular assessments being made, in particular due to the social media presence or the ability to read his social media presence and even the retweets he's done. I know they call it X now. Do they say re-Xing or, well, whatever. We know what a retweet is. But there's been other Catholics. I even think of I saw a little blurb by kind of a popular media figure, Matt Walsh, who's a Catholic, right? And he was even saying, look, you can't exactly map these popes into politically what we are doing as a nation. And he said, he holds to traditional things about marriage and sexuality and LGBTQ issues.
You're talking about the Pope, not Matt Walsh.
Yeah,
yes.
Right. This is Matt Walsh talking about the Pope. And Matt Walsh works for the Daily Wire, a very right-wing, as it were, very politically active media source. And but he was saying, but he has also tweeted specific things about immigrants, and in some ways speaks in ways that Americans classify as more progressive or leftist. But he said, but you can't exactly do that with the Pope. And so I bring all this up just for our listeners to know that you're going to Google the Pope, and you're going to get receipts, and you're going to get a track record, and that doesn't exactly give us the lay of the land of what this guy is going to be like.
Right, and I think that I think part of what you're saying is the problem that we witness in the American political scene, which is that everything is polarized. And when you say something is moderate, I don't think most people even know what a moderate is. You're on one side extreme or the other. But I do think that he does have a bit of a record of doing something differently than the way Francis did it. For example, he in Peru, you can see this in his bishopric. He specifically opposed the inclusion of gender ideology in the Peruvian primary school curricular. And here's a direct quote. He said that it promotes, quote, genders that don't exist, end quote. So the point being is that's not exactly the way Francis would have spoken. So he appears particularly on the sexual matters and the gender issues, those sorts of things, as well as women in the priesthood. He's been pretty clear about affirming the traditional positions on that.
Yep.
Now, it is interesting. He was schooled at the Catholic Theological Union here in Chicago. Picked up an MDiv from there. Not what you might call a bastion of strong conservative Roman Catholic thought. So there's other possibilities theologically that we may be finding too.
But he's been serving, dear listeners, in Peru.
Mm-hmm.
And Roman Catholicism in Central and especially South America is different than it is in the United States of America. And that's why I think it's right that one of the commentators, particularly soon after he was elected, said an American pope, that is an American-born pope, has been elected. But he's never served an American diocese. He's never been bishop here of a diocese and is the least American, in that sense, United States American, of anybody who could be elected from here. So I think he's bringing some different sensibilities, perhaps. And that's why what Matt Walsh is saying is even more legitimate in the sense that you can't just be looking at him thinking whatever he's saying, that how this tracks with American political ideology and rhetoric.
Right,
It's a little more complicated.
A reminder, too, that look, the papacy is the papacy is the papacy. And it's important that we remember that. One of the first things that he did, that Pope Leo XIV did, is granting a plenary indulgence to all the faithful gathered in St. Peter's Square, right? These people, and those who apparently, who came in, the plenary indulgence. Remember, this is what the Reformation talked about, was the Pope claiming to be able to mitigate the punishment of sin. Now admittedly, you look at the Roman Catholic Catechism now, they try to make very clear there's a difference between eternal punishment and temporal punishment. So they're not talking about a remission of eternal punishment. However, he is talking about purgatory. And by issuing an indulgence, we see the papacy is continuing on as it always has. We still have a pope who's saying, oh, because you came to St. Peter's Square or you watched it, you have, a plenary indulgence for purgatory, effectively.
Right, and as I like to say, that's the good news, that you have this indulgence from purgatory. The bad news, of course, is there is no purgatory.
Well, yeah. But it's just a reminder, and I think that we always have to keep that in mind as we're thinking about ecumenical comments, anything we may or may not see as a positive relative to Francis. Look, we still have significant theological and biblical differences with what the papacy stands for, what the Roman Catholic Church stands for. My hope remains that a day will come when there will be true spiritual reform taking place, and we can hope for that.
Well, thank you, Dr. Strange and Dr. Compton, for helping us think through the arrival of a new pope as we continue to reflect on what we believe about the nature of the church, authority, and a variety of other things. And that's exactly where we're headed next. In our upcoming episodes, we'll take a deeper look at the Reformation, what drove it, who led it, and why it continues to shape how Protestants think about the church, including the office of the Pope. Dr. Alan Strange will be back with me as we explore the sparks that set the 16th century ablaze and the enduring legacy of those tumultuous, world-changing years. So stay with us and don't miss what's coming next on MarsCast. Make sure you share this content with others who may be interested, and be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite shows. I'm Jared Luttjeboer. This has been an episode of MarsCast. See you next time.